So, Vice-Marshal Elliot, Craig Marsh, and the Head of College of Business at the University of Lincoln.
Nice to meet you.
It's lovely to talk to you. Would you mind just saying a little bit about yourself before we start our conversation?
So I have been serving in the Royal Air Force now for over 33 years, which is a bit of a surprise. So when I joined, I was straight from university thinking I was going to do 6 years in the Royal Air Force and move on to something else. And I joined as an air traffic controller, and throughout my career I've had the opportunity to do jobs I never imagined I would actually have the opportunity to do. So it's been a great journey so far, and I think there's still more to do.
Fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about your experience and expertise in that area. So Christine, we've got a particular agenda here for this discussion, and what I'd like to do is just to get some of your insights in a theme that is around the millennial generation. We hear a lot about the millennials and the impact that they're having in our organisations. So I'd really like just to explore that with you, and then think a little bit about what your perspective is on how that's having an effect on the Royal Air Force as an organisation, and of course the leadership of the RAF as well, if that's okay. So we'll just spend 20 minutes having a chat about that. So the millennial generation has often been characterised as this group as having a very different sort of value set and attitude and behaviour to work to perhaps previous generations. And I'd just be very interested if we could start by hearing your perspective on that, whether you're seeing that or how you're seeing that.
So I had the privilege of being station commander at RAF Halton. So that's where Phase 1 recruits came through to do training. And that was an interesting insight, because I had an assumption that the kids of today, or as then, would be more challenging and pushing back on authority more and perhaps more needy. And I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised that that wasn't generally the case. What I did notice was a thirst for information and a thirst for knowledge and a sense of immediacy to decision making and the kind of facts behind decisions. And I think I reflected on that was the access to information that kids have today, or young people joining the Air Force through not just social media, but just access to the internet and being able to use emails and get instant. So they're used to sort of a battle rhythm and a response mechanism that generally is quicker than I think when I joined the Royal Air Force.
So that's really interesting. So that's one particular shift that you feel is different from
Yes.
what you might have seen in previous generations, or from our generation perhaps, where there's this immediacy of information that they are used to getting through the internet.
And I think when that ability to, when they can't tap into that initially, there's kind of what do I do? But what I observed was, once that people get used to being in a different organisation that has a different framework around it, and that immediacy disappears, and the access to the internet or social media is not removed, but their access is limited, they do adjust.
Right.
So we had I do reflect on, we had one intake that was particularly challenging because the communication skills were not as maybe mature. Their eye contact, their ability to do body language was maybe not as you would expect, because they hadn't had that experience. But once you actually help them to read people and actually interact in a different way, they soon overcame any sort of perceived failings or any perceived challenges.
Isn't that interesting? So there's nothing that they're not kind of being rewired in any way. It's just that their upbringing has led them to a different sort of behaviour to what you might.
I think it's not just upbringing; it's experiences. So it's experiences at school. So I reflect on the use of technology in schools. So the use of textbooks diminishing, the use of IT to support learning. So they're used to a different way of interaction. So when you come to a military that's initially austere from a technology perspective, even though the Air Force were a technological service, but initially that can be a culture shock. Yeah. And I think you have to understand as an organisation to help people through that shock. But what I witnessed, what I reflected on, is people adjust, but you have to support them through that adjustment.
And of course, Halton would be the place that you would do that in a sense. Yeah. So if you were to extend that to the wider Air Force, does that mean that, on the whole, what's happening is that these young people are adjusting to the culture of the Royal Air Force, rather than the Royal Air Force itself sort of evolving to take into account the fact that they're getting a different sort of generation in?
So I think it's a bit of both. I reflect now in the role I'm in at the moment. So I look after the career management of the Royal Air Force. It's a pretty generic description, but that's pretty much it. So what we notice is the demand for the information and engagement was greater. So we've changed our career management system to enable a much more open dialogue with youngsters all the way through to more experienced officers and airmen. So we have had to adjust, and I think that's an important thing. So people they have access to someone to have an independent conversation. So, and that we implemented that over a year ago, because we knew there was a demand there that previously probably wasn't there.
How about that? So it's responding to this. They're almost naturally wanting information on demand and a transparency of information. So you've adjusted the way that careers are done with them as a result of that.
Yes, but I don't think it's just the access to technology. I think, so for us, I look at the type of people we're attracting now, and we're trying to attract more women. Right. So if you're attracting a different proportion of males and females, certainly you want to keep people within the service. You have to be able to engage with people so they can look at how they live their lives in the service, not just their professional lives. And women, if you want to keep them post having children, there is a different way that you have to engage. So it's not just the individuals that change, the social dynamic and the makeup of the service has changed as well, and is changing.
And how is that reflected of that social dynamic? Could you say a little bit more about that, how that dynamic? Because clearly there are different demands, but actually recruiting more women and providing them with a career and a life inside the service, that's going to present a particular.
So if I look back at my 30 years, it was very unusual even for married servicemen to have spouses that were professional. Now that we have so many equal partnerships, as I would call them, we have people very successful professional careers outside the service, married to servicemen and women in. So that is a dynamic that wasn't there before either, in the same proportion. And having more women within the service, you have got to address different issues in terms of being able to plan in a longer timescale and being able to communicate about choices and about understanding what the family dynamics were. So whereas I think 30 years ago, the family dynamics weren't up front and centre as they are today. So it's not just a social, it's not just a change in individuals. It's actually socially, I think we're made up differently in the service as well.
That's really interesting. So perhaps I could just then draw us on to a discussion about some of the challenges that presents for leadership in the Royal Air Force. So we've talked about a couple of the changes in dynamics on a new generation coming in, some of their expectations, how the RAF is adjusting to some of those expectations. What about the job of a leader in the RAF, if it can be so general? But if I can't ask you that, then in your role.
So I think that's a really good question, and I think I would summarise it is telling the story behind decisions. Is actually the why. Explaining the narrative. The narrative is important, because if you don't explain what the narrative is, the way the social sort of networks go these days, something else will replace that narrative. So it's actually making sure people understand why you're on a journey and what that journey, what their part is in that journey. And although that's always been the case, I feel it's even more important today, because people will fill in the void. And they'll have an ability to be able to socially network before you realise that a groupthink has happened, because people have got on and said, well, they've come up with their own explanation rather than actually service. So I think getting people to understand the why, understand the narrative, and communicate. It is all about ensuring that story is repeated, and it's in many different forms. It's in many different ways. So the old thing about leadership, standing up in front of your troops, saying it once and it being cascaded down, I'm not sure that is as relevant now. It's making sure you communicate with people in many different ways now.
Is that right? Do you think that's partly because of? So if I'm somebody who's joining the RAF in 2019, is my expectation of leaders different than it might have been before? Is that part of what's going on? I mean, do I look at leadership in a different way? Do I look at hierarchy in a different way from previous generations, or not?
So I think I would use Bolton as a reflection as well.
Indeed.
I think people like strong leaders. I think it is not a generational thing.
Right.
I think people like to be given clear direction, clear boundaries, and a framework. And as long as that communication and that visibility of the leaders there, I think it is as applicable now as it always has been. But I do think it's the communication. I think there's a demand for communication and the knowledge that wasn't there before. And it's about how you communicate with those individuals.
Has that affected how leaders are trained and developed in the RAF at all? Is that starting to filter through?
I do think this, and I think the Royal Air Force has always had an ability to look at leadership in an unformulated way, if I would put it that way. I think it is about authenticity, and your leadership has got to come from within, not from sort of a textbook. Right. So and I think that as long as that stays, I think you can adapt to any situation. And I think people want to feel as an individual, not just part of a collective all the time. So our leadership training is very much about understanding the individual, not just about understanding the group of individuals that you're leading. So I do think we have changed the way that we're
developing leaders. Yes. And is the rank structure, it's always fascinated me as outside the RAF, how the rank structure sort of plays into that. And I'm trying to think of a way of posing that question, but because what you've defined, of course, is a very effective model for leadership. Does the rank structure affect that at all in terms of how leadership is done these days and that kind of model?
So I think this is with creativity. So if you've got a rank structure, sometimes if you slavishly apply a rank system about the passage of knowledge, sometimes that can challenge creativity. And I think the challenge for leadership today is within that rank-based organisation at times to be able to see past a rank and see skills and experiences. It's not just about whether you're an officer in the air or where you sit. And to be able to develop ideas and pull those ideas from wherever, I think that is the challenge of leadership, not just looking at the rank that someone holds within the organisation.
So it's almost regardless of where those skills and experiences that you need to deliver a mission come from, you find them and you mobilise them.
Yes, absolutely, but there always will be a point that decision making sits within a rank structure. So at some point responsibility and accountability comes with the rank, but creativity doesn't need to come with responsibility and accountability.
I think I understand. So the other thing I've also heard about the modern leadership in the RAF is that actually you're having to mobilise resources from out with your command structure and often from external, particularly as you get more senior in the RAF, from external sources as well. Does that affect how you do your task as a leader? Because the RAF isn't just, of course, about those who are actually enlisted now. It's about a much broader group of individuals, isn't it?
So you're absolutely right. So the types of people we're leading now, it's a much broader kirk, much more diverse group. But if you understand that not all even if it was all servicemen and women, one leadership style doesn't work in all contexts. So I think it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same principle. So you depend on the context, depending on the individual you're dealing with, irrespective of whether we're in a uniform or not. If you understand that individual and what motivates them and what works for them, then leadership applies equally to them as it does to a serviceman or a servicewoman. So
it's almost thinking about that if your job is to get people moving towards a common objective, then you are a leader almost regardless of your rank or who those individuals are in the service.
And it's about creating a sense of identity and a sense of common purpose. So no matter where you sit in the organisation, that you as a leader, though, that sense of identity and common purpose, I think transcends what terms of conditions of service at any part of that team.
That's really interesting. And so perhaps I could also just ask you about your own leadership journey in the RAF, if I may. And does your idea or has your concept or your the way that you do leadership, has that evolved over the course of your service career, or I don't know, are there some things that have stayed the same? I'd just be interested in your own reflection.
I think my sense of leadership has changed. I think as a young officer, I think it's about growing in confidence and understanding yourself. And I think what I've learned in leadership is taking time out to reflect, and I think that's the bit I probably didn't do enough of when I was a young leader. And that those reflections about what you did well, what you didn't do well, and I think that's a really important thing. So I think that's what I've learned. But being true to yourself, being authentic, and I know I've used that word before, I think that is critical. Because if you try and apply yourself in a way that it doesn't fit well, I think it's not good for your own resilience, and it certainly is not good for the team that works for you either. Right.
I think those of us in leadership positions can certainly associate with that. Do you think it's something that comes with age and experience, or is it something that our young leaders can learn as well?
So I think it comes with a personality type. I'm not sure age and experience, because I've met an awful lot of people who are and not just within the military, who potentially have not developed as leaders. So I do think it's about something about your personality type.
Yeah.
But I would reflect on resilience. So I wish I'd thought about building resilience as a leader when I was younger, but having that space to step back and think and reflect. Physical and mental resilience, I think, is key.
Indeed. And actually that space for reflection often is what helps you build resilience, isn't it?
I think so.
So if you were talking to a group of new or young leaders, that would be probably one of the things that you would call out, is to think about how that's done.
And a big thing is learning when not to make a decision.
Really? Okay.
So it's sometimes it's about knowing when to pause rather than when to know what to make decisions. So I think, and that's something that I think reflection brings as well.
Indeed. So sometimes you feel very pressured to act, and sometimes actually not acting, or at least not for a while, is the right thing to do. That's very interesting. So if I may just, sort of as a final reflection, and particularly given your position, so we talked about some of the challenges and opportunities for leadership in the modern RAF as it is now. Do you see, how do you see this evolving, if I may? Because I know that the work that the RAF are doing and the environment the RAF operating in is evolving rapidly. So do you see an evolution in the way that the RAF does leadership, or do you think it's got it right? Do you think there's going to be things changing in that respect? I'm thinking about things like the use of technology, where often these days it's not even necessarily people that are involved in being led, but there's things, jobs are getting automated and work's getting automated. I mean, is that something that would change the way leadership is done?
So I think it's leadership of change that's critical.
Right.
Especially when technology is forcing a pace that we have to do. So I think that it is about how we lead that change, which is probably something we'd have to make sure that we prepare our leaders for, because it is and I think change with technology is a fantastic thing, but people have to be prepared and understand what commitment that change is. Going back to communication again, it's been how you engage through that change, and I think the Royal Air Force does do leadership well. I think we do have self-reflection, and we always look at the ways that we can improve how we do our leadership. But I do think leadership of change is something we've got to just make sure that we understand and prepare people within that for.
And in a service which is almost by definition quite high, because it's a highly technical service, which is quite well structured, it must be quite an interesting challenge to work out how you continue to deliver the service's mission and also respond to change at the same time. That must be quite an interesting, challenging balance to get right. Is that right?